when does it click for you? When does it feel, can you tell when it feels right, either that the advice feels right or that this person is coming from such a fundamentally good place that you want to just continually work with them in that kind of mentorship place?
Yeah, I think the way you framed the question is how I'd answer it, but in reverse. So you said, "How do I know that they're coming from such a good place or something?" You know, I think if I feel that they have the necessary context, that's number one. And then if I feel that they sort of pass the bias sniff test, that they're not saying something with a heavy bias, either because they have a dog in the fight, or more typically it's because, I don't know if you've heard the expression, if you go to a foot doctor and you say, a podiatrist, and you say my back hurts, the foot doctor will probably be like, oh, the arch in your foot, I think it's collapsing and probably pulling on a nerve or something. In other words, doctors see what they have been trained to see. Whereas if you went to a different kind of doctor, they might think that it's something else in their field. So if there's a overwhelming bias, like someone sees something a certain way because obviously they'd see it that way, that's how they've been trained to view the world, I tend to discount that kind of advice. So do they have the necessary context? Are they free of a really obvious bias? And then the third thing for me is, can I stress test the idea with them a little bit? Can I play devil's advocate? Can I poke holes in it? Can I ask questions? Are they willing to let their idea be sort of turned around and held up to the light? And some people don't like that. So if the person is has the context, is free of bias, and is willing to kind of go round for round with me on an idea for a little bit, that's usually the only way that an idea survives enough to get put into action vis-a-vis, other ideas from my company.
Holding that thought about, putting this advice through the stress test, I'm just curious, you touched on this very, very briefly earlier in our session, but how have you just helped yourself either get better at taking advice or discerning which advice to take?
I think trying to be patient and grateful, looking at the person giving the advice almost as much as the advice itself. So there's certain people that have given me many pieces of advice, maybe 80 or 90% of it's good and 10% is bad. On the day where it's bad or it feels bad or I disagree with it, which might not mean it's bad, it might just mean I disagree. You don't want to bite the hand that feeds you. This is someone who's invested, who cares, who wants to give you advice. And so being gentle with how you receive the advice and grateful and protecting the relationship, so they're not like, fuck you and never give you advice again. You want to make sure that you don't turn off people who you trust. Um, as for how to know if it's actionable or good, I don't know. Again, my method, again, I don't know that I'd recommend it because it tends to turn a lot of people off, but would be sort of challenging, not in a super aggressive way, but like, well, what about this? Or are you sure? What if this were the case? Or what if this happened? Or, and just sort of letting them really make a case for their initial piece of advice again and again in different circumstances. So again, holding it up to the light and seeing as you turn it, how different grooves catch the light. And if the idea is good 360 degrees, or if there might be a flaw with the idea. That's why I really like the board, because we'll bring something up on a board call. Someone will say something, I might respond, and then other people weigh in. So it's a nice way to sort of naturally turn the object. It's not me going back and forth with one human, which can feel like arguing. It's a group of people discussing something, which is effectively the same thing, right? People saying, well, what about this? And actually, I think this, and in my experience, this. And by the time 7 people have spoken on the matter, you've really thought about it pretty carefully as a group. Um, so I'd say I've sort of absorbed, swallowed and digested more advice out of my board in a couple months than I have from any one individual in a year historically.
Has there ever been an instance in which somebody gave you advice and you weren't all the way sure about it, but you still implemented it for the hub anyway? and it either pleasantly surprised you or just reinforced your prior beliefs?
Yeah. I mean, I've never spoken about this publicly, but I guess now since I've called him by name, we've talked a lot on this channel about my depression. So my depression was not great. My mental health wasn't great. And I had just started dating someone, and I was quite, I was trying to really, I thought she might be the one. And I really wanted to be present for that relationship. So adding those two things together, I was probably the most distracted I've ever been from my company. And it was at a time where Chris had been, from Thought Catalog, had been um, giving me more and more and more advice, and we were speaking almost daily about the company, and he was quite involved. It wasn't sort of like an occasional chat. It was like a real, he was quite in. So I started paying him hourly because I sort of felt like I was pulling down too much in his time. And then sort of said, I think I probably said, can you help with X, or what do you think about Y? And he's like, listen, man, like it's getting to the point where the only way I can do it is to just do it, to really jump in all the way. And so he quoted me a price to basically buy him as a CEO. And I effectively handed him the wheel, of my ship. Like, you're the captain, like you make the calls. And it was an act of strength and a vote of confidence in him, insofar as he has a company that's worth, a lot of money and is quite successful. And he's been at it a long time and bootstrapped the company largely, meaning he didn't take on tons of venture money. So in a lot of ways, I was like, he's far more successful than I. If anyone's going to succeed, it's him. So that was one thought. And the second thought was like, I'm really depressed right now, and I'm also trying to like get a relationship off the ground. So if there were a time for me to take my hands off the wheel, this would be it. And so for probably 3 months, Chris was the de facto leader of my company. I was obviously still working every day and still involved, but he was calling the shots and making all the big decisions. And in the beginning, I tried to sort of grapple with him a bit, and he basically said, like, listen, man, you gave me the wheel, so either fuck off and give me the wheel, or don't. But like, if you want me to lead, like, go away. So I was like, okay. And again, partially because I was relieved to take a little break, I sort of went away. And it didn't work at all. It was a disaster. It was like a really bad 3 months for my business. And I sort of thought, let's give it time, like it might be just him adjusting. It might be just, but it's really hard and it's complicated. And he was effectively, even though he's a hardened entrepreneur, new to my business. And he did a bad job. And I sort of learned, it took a while for our friendship to bounce back, which it has. But I learned something that he had taught me, which was, I didn't want to believe at the time because it's a very lonely thought, but like, this company will live and die with you. And like, no one's coming to save you, is what he told me a long time ago. So I sort of learned then, ironically, when he tried to save me, that no one's coming to save me. Like, it has to be me being the captain of this ship. I started, I have to finish it. And no one's going to just like rescue me or complete the thought. I have to complete the thought. So that was a hard lesson. And it was costly. I mean, financially and emotionally and so on. And maybe even in the eyes of my team, because it was sort of weird, right? Like someone else was calling the shots for a little while. But those 3 months, I think, this is a really crass analogy that maybe will turn off 3/4 of the people that listen to this. But in the same way that like Trump has done immense damage, particularly in the past week or two, to our country, it seems the tide is turning a little bit towards the common enemy of like, this guy fucked up a lot of stuff. Let's link arms and fix this. And so sometimes when someone fucks things up enough, it makes the problems all the more obvious. And it brought me and say Jason, my CTO, my chief technology officer, together closer. And it really brought the leader out of me, I think, more than would have otherwise. So in many ways, like, we took some steps backwards, but we've taken more steps forward since. And the damage that was caused was replaced by a lot of learning and evolution.
As you're kind of revolving around advice and, like, to your point, or how you called it, putting it through the smell test, are there any key questions that you ask yourself to just kind of evaluate it? Is there a rubric?
This is what I'd put it through, and I'm making this up on the spot. Does the person have the necessary context such that I will trust their advice or opinion, or that taking it won't fuck me? And if not, how can I give them the necessary context? Does this person have an overwhelming bias, or do they tend to see the world a certain way no matter what? And will that fuck me if I take their advice simply because they tend to give that kind of advice? And then the third thing is, can I spend a little bit of time looking at the world through the glasses of, I've just made this decision? So projecting into the future and imagining that you've made the decision, and what are the other dominoes that fall after this decision? And is that a good thing or a bad one? And ideally role playing with the person who had the idea in the first place of, well, if that happens, that means these 6 things will happen. Are those good? And what's the fallout from that? So did they have the context they need? Did they have an overwhelming bias? And if they do, can you sort of strip it out or isolate for it? And then can you stress test the idea a bit, ideally with the person, to make sure that it is indeed a good idea vis-a-vis all the other things that will happen consequently?
And then my last question for you is that often when people take advice and then implement that advice in their company or their life more broadly and things backfire, they tend to blame the person who gave them the advice. They absolve themselves of any culpability, even though they were the person who implemented the advice. Is there a middle ground there? And what would you want people to keep in mind as they're just trying to course correct?
Giving someone else control of my company for 3 months and them royally fucking it up. And yet it was net positive for my company. It was my decision to do it. I was the one that had to fix it. I don't blame the person that fucked it up, and we're good friends to this day. There's a book called Absolute Ownership or Extreme Ownership by a Navy SEAL I like, all about how if you're in charge, if you're the leader, everything is your fault. If you didn't make the mistake directly, someone that you manage or mentor or hired or trained did, which means that you didn't do some of those things correctly. So taking ownership always and not pinning anything on anyone else. Another thing we talked about is the Andreessen quote that you mentioned in our last session: there aren't any silver bullets, only lead ones. I've been at this long enough that, like, there are no silver bullets. There are no out of the park home runs where just everything works one day. And similarly, it's hard to destroy a company in one day too, although it can happen. And so what you realize is that it's just day after day after day after day. And so if one day or one piece of advice is bad, or one piece of advice is good, that's another thing. No mentor is going to save you, no advisor, no piece of advice, no meeting. I've had probably 7 or 8 meetings, Ella, where I'm like, this is the one. I've had that thought, like, this is the meeting that I'm going to be talking about when I do my interview for Crunchbase, when I sell my company for $100 million. I'd be like, well, the turning point was when I spoke to Terry. It never works like that. Like, you never have that one meeting that just completely changes everything forever. We hear stories like that, but they are so rare. Like you hear about people winning the lottery. And in the same way, one bad piece of advice doesn't wreck a company. So if your company's failing, it's because of a lot of little decisions that were made, right? So entrepreneurship is all about trying things, making mistakes, micro adjustments, like never putting, it's like walking on ice. If you put too much weight on one foot, you're going to slip. But if you kind of carefully tread, you can make it across. So if you take advice too strongly, advice that you think is going to make your company completely or is going to ruin your company completely, that's never the case. And it's really just about day after day after day after day after day building something. So even if you take a little step backwards, you can always take a step or two forwards the next day or next week or next month.